while we're on the detox part, let's stick here for a bit. And we can tie this to your personal story. You mentioned earlier the mold problem you had.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's going to be very individual. You talked about the urine test, how you can find that out. But what are some of the lifestyle practices and then specific things you did to detox the body?
Yeah. So we just have to go back to the basics again. Poop, pee, sweat. Right? Um, if you are not having regular bowel movements, and by regular bowel movements, I mean within 45 minutes of waking, you should be having your first fairly substantial bowel movement. If you're not, that is a sign that you have some level of gut dysbiosis. Um, and there are people that go 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, or even longer without a single bowel movement. I would argue that most of this is related somewhat to gut microbiome, but more often it is related to intestinal motility, which is why I am such a huge fan of genetic testing for deficiency. I believe that, in the myriad of supplements that are out there, um, if you really want to drive yourself up a wall, just start Googling around about great supplements. Do I take CoQ10, resveratrol, St. John's wort, ashwagandha, NMN, NAD, nicotinamide riboside? What about this liposomal glutathione? There's so many different supplements out there. You can get paralysis of analysis. But there's a very easy way to find out what your body is deficient in. And if you don't supplement for deficiency, nothing else matters. Like we believe this in plant physiology, but we don't believe this in human physiology for some reason, even though it's very valid. If you had a leaf rotting in a palm tree, let's say, and you called a true arborist, a true botanist out to your house, they wouldn't even touch the leaf, right? They would core test the soil, and then they would say, you know what, Jesse, there's no nitrogen in this soil. And they would add nitrogen to the soil and the leaf would heal. Human beings are no different. When you are deficient in certain raw material, you get the expression of disease. And then you are living with what you think are the consequences of aging, which are not consequences of aging at all. They are consequences of missing raw material. So things like weight gain, water retention, poor focus and concentration, poor sleep patterns, laying down to go to sleep at night and having your mind wake up, and ruminating for hours instead of falling asleep, not having regular bowel movements, water retention, hormone disruption. Very often, in fact, in almost every case, you can link these back to nutrient deficiencies. And so there's a process in the body called methylation, which is the process by which we take all of the raw material that enters our body and we convert it into the usable form. And so I always use the analogy that, we pull crude oil out of the ground, but you can't put crude oil into your gas tank because the car doesn't understand that fuel source. So crude oil has to be refined into gasoline, and now the car can run. In human beings, it's no different. Only that refining process is called methylation. So we take all kinds of compounds into the human body, vitamin B12, B vitamins. You take things like folic acid, for example. You put this compound into the human body. Folic acid is useless, absolutely useless, unless it can be converted into methylfolate. Well, about half the population has a gene mutation, MTHFR, that doesn't allow them to make this conversion. Well, that doesn't sound like a big deal. I can't convert folic acid into methylfolate until you realize that folic acid is the most prevalent nutrient in the human diet. So in the United States, we spray all of our grains with folic acid. All white flour, rice, bread, pasta, grains, cereals of any kind by law are sprayed with the chemical folic acid.
Even organic?
Organic is not. So foods that are fortified or enriched are sprayed with folic acid. So if something is fortified or enriched, that's a code word for sprayed with folic acid. And people think that folic acid is a naturally occurring vitamin, vitamin B9. It's not. We make folic acid in a laboratory. You cannot find folic acid anywhere on the surface of the earth. It does not exist naturally in nature. And so you'll never convince me that something that we synthetically make in a laboratory that wasn't even around until 1983, I want to say, is somehow essential to optimal health. It's certainly not essential to a healthy pregnancy. Methylfolate is essential to a healthy pregnancy. Methylfolate prevents neural tube defects. Methylfolate has a positive effect on fertility, on uterine wall implantation of the egg, and on cell wall adhesion. But folic acid can have the opposite effect. In fact, folic acid is likely the leading cause of postpartum depression in pregnant females. Even though postpartum depression, we call it postpartum, it begins during pregnancy, but it usually coincides with a woman, because she was told by her OBGYN, starting to take high doses of folic acid. You put 1,500, 1,800 times the recommended daily allowance of folic acid into a woman's body with the gene mutation MTHFR, she's virtually certain to get anxiety and exhibit depressive symptoms. It'll also shut her gut down and disrupt her sleep. And they blame it on the pregnancy, not on the vitamin. So usually after the pregnancy ends, they will stop taking the vitamin, and then the symptoms will go away. So it reinforces that it was the pregnancy and not, and they don't blame it on the vitamin. So I think that everyone should do this test once in their lifetime. You don't have to do my test. There are lots of great methylation tests out there, but you get a genetic methylation test. Because another way to get real paralysis of analysis is to start going down the road of gene testing, because you will get so much non-actionable information. It's like a pilot flying from Miami to New York, doesn't care what the weather is in Texas. It's great information, but it has nothing to do with that flight. And so when you start looking at genetic testing, don't think that testing more genes is necessarily better. That's one of the ways that genetic testing companies sell to the public, is they go, well, we test 50 genes. Oh, we test 90 genes. We test 200 genes. The majority of those genes are not actionable. Hair color, eye color, skin color, whether or not you have detached earlobes, it might be great information, but it's not actionable. Genes of methylation you can supplement for their deficiency. So if you have MTHFR, you need to be supplementing with methylfolate. If you have MTR or MTRR, you need to be taking trimethylglycine to lower and metabolize homocysteine. If you have the COMT gene mutation, depending on which variant, you have ruminating thoughts. You likely suffer from anxiety that has no trigger, that you can't point to the trigger that causes it. You have got motility issues. You have ruminating thoughts at night, which is a big one that robs you from sleep. You very often have a tendency towards obsessive compulsive disorder, which is when we lack organization in the mind, we crave organization in our outside environment. Or you're going to get told you have attention deficit disorder, which is not an attention deficit at all. It's actually an attention overload disorder. It's too many windows open at the same time. So it's not an inability to focus or concentrate. It is an inability to focus or concentrate on so many things. And so there's a difference. Modern medicine says, well, if the mind's racing, let's pump amphetamines into the body to race the central nervous system to match the pace of the mind, right? And that's a horrible idea, Vyvanse, Ritalin, Adderall, because then you're just taking the system that's not broken, which is the central nervous system, and you're breaking it to match the system that is, right? It's like getting a flat tire and, getting out and slashing your other 3 tires to create equilibrium. So the idea should be to quiet the mind, and you can quiet the mind with basic methylated nutrients. Like I think if you're on a multivitamin, it should be a methylated multivitamin. Don't just take a multivitamin with folic acid and cyanocobalamin and the non-pyridoxal 5-phosphate form of B vitamins. Take a methylated vitamin. What that will do is it will make sure that those nutrients have already been converted into the usable form. Now your body can use them. Because again, when you deprive the human body of certain raw material, you get the expression of disease. And one of those expressions of disease is the entire category of autoimmune. There's so many people probably watching this podcast right now that have some form of autoimmune. They have Crohn's disease, they have Sjogren's, they have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, God forbid they have lupus or, rheumatoid arthritis. And when they went to see their doctor and were diagnosed, they were told, we don't know what caused this. You just woke up one day and your immune system decided to attack your colon, and now you have Crohn's disease. Or your immune system went after your thyroid. No reason. There's a reason. Your aunt had it, your uncle had it. That was complete nonsense. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is not carried on the genome. Neither is type 2 diabetes. Neither is hypertension. They run in families, but the disease is not being passed from generation to generation. That is a critical distinction. What's being passed from generation to generation is the inability for the body to refine a raw material, which causes the same deficiency, which leads to the same condition. And that deficiency can be fixed. Again, I don't know if I answered your question. My wife says I eat people's face, so I'm sorry if I
No,
just
that
went
was
on a
great.
tangent.
So we have the methylation testing. It's something we all need to do once. What about the nutrient deficiency piece? Is that something we test for as well?
No. So your genes will tell you what you need to supplement with. You can't convert folic acid to methylfolate. You supplement with methylfolate by weight. On the test that I built through 10x Health, which took me about 2.5 years to build that algorithm. You take a cheek swab, you send it into a lab, the results come back electronically, and then it will tell you exactly what supplements in what doses to take. And then if you want, you click a button, it will drop those supplements right to your front door. Again, you don't have to use mine. There are lots of great tests out there. And there are lots of great supplement companies out there that make great methylated vitamins. But the point is to test those genes of methylation and then discover what methylated nutrients you need. You want to see magic happen in human beings. You give their body the raw material it needs to do its job. There are so many people listening to this podcast right now that have anxiety. They don't know why. They have attention deficit disorder. They just figure it's something that they're going to have to live the rest of their life with. Like I said, they have ruminating thoughts. They can't understand why they continue to be slightly estrogen dominant, and they have that, what we call the estrogen band. And nothing is more frustrating than in a female than to be doing everything right, eating right, exercising, getting decent sleep, and still not being able to lose that water weight around your flank, which is generally slight estrogen dominance. Because these genes of methylation, specifically COMT, catechol O-methyltransferase, also eliminate, in women, eliminate estrogen. They send estrogen down the E2 pathway. And so you're doing everything right. And and I'm just picking on the ladies here for a minute because there seems to be a plethora of females that come through my clinic system with the same problem. And they're like, Gary, I don't get it. I wake up in the morning, fasted, I have a cup of black coffee, I go to Orange Theory, I go hammer down for 55 minutes. I've been doing that for 3 months, 5 days a week, and I haven't lost a single pound. So if you fix methylation, in fact, if you look at a lot of really good hormone testing, like I think the gold standard for female hormone testing is something called a Dutch test, right? It's a 24-hour urine test. If you actually look right on that test, you will see COMT, the gene mutation, COMT, and you will see arrows where it actually takes estrogen and eliminates the phytoestrogens. It takes the metabolized estrogens and gets rid of them. Well, if you start to build up too much estrogen, what is the primary role of estrogen in a woman's body? To bind water in the interstitial space. So as estrogen rises, water retention increases. That's why we call this the estrogen band. That's why in a woman that's, during a normal cycle, it's perfectly normal for her estrogen to be in the teens. And it's also perfectly normal for it to be in the 400s. So what determines how her levels are high or low? Well, you certainly don't want to just take a blood snapshot. You want to look at the ratio of those hormones and how they travel through the day, how they move through the cycle. So when she gets pregnant, her estrogen will go into the 4,000s. And why is that? To retain water, to swell the uterus, to pad the uterine wall, to protect the fetus. But you don't want that post-pregnancy. You don't want to be retaining a lot of water. And you may be retaining water in estrogen dominant, not because there's anything wrong with your hormones, but because one of your methylation genes is broken that you could easily supplement for and begin to catabolize estrogen, and that problem goes away.
You've already stated the fact that we don't want people to become overwhelmed and just drop all this and forget about it. When it comes to testing, I want to make sure we're really clear on what the biggest impact tests are. So we've talked about testing for mold. You mentioned the Dutch test for hormones.
Yeah.
You've talked about the methylation genetic test. What would the basic package look like? And if it's different male and female, adult, what would that look like?
Here's how I would start. I think every human being should do a genetic methylation test once in their lifetime. You do it once. You do it on your kids once. You can do it on an infant because the genes you're born with are the genes you die with. That test will cost you anywhere between $195 and $600, depending on the test. And you do that test once in your lifetime. You will never repeat that test. And that's why I'm such a fan of it. That will tell you where you start on the supplement bandwagon. So it clears all of that noise about what should I be taking? My uncle is taking this new glutathione, but my buddy is taking an MN, and my coworker is taking resveratrol, and this guy is taking CoQ10, and I'm supposed to take this super greens, and you can just get paralysis of analysis. So stop asking the outside world and start asking your inside world, and it will give you a very specific set of answers. And then you start on a methylated multivitamin. And the second thing I would do is, if you're going to move to blood testing, I would look at these three categories in your blood. I would look at your glycemic profile, which is simply your glucose, your hemoglobin A1C, and your insulin. Okay, that is truly where the rubber meets the road. When we talk about metabolic syndrome, which is this complex of hypertension, high triglycerides, low HDL, hypertension, insulin resistance. Insulin resistance as a single comorbidity is one of the major. It contributes to more comorbidities than any other morbidity factor. And I used to be a mortality expert for large life insurance. So when you take any disease etiological process, you add anemia, you get one cofactor. If you add insulin resistance, you exacerbate cardiovascular disease, you exacerbate the risk factor for all-cause mortality, you exacerbate the risk factor for autoimmune, you exacerbate the risk factor for certain forms of cancer, you dramatically exacerbate the risk factor for atherosclerosis, arterial sclerosis, and metabolic syndrome. So insulin resistance, if you're going to control anything, you want to be aggressively controlling your blood sugar, right? Hemoglobin A1C is the 3-month average of your blood sugar. Insulin is a level fasted that will tell you how much insulin is needed to keep your blood sugar under control. The second category I would and not even a functional medicine doctor, any primary care doctor can run these tests. And usually I would hope anyway, they're part of a routine annual physical exam. The second thing I would look at is I would look at your hormone profile. And here's what's critical when you're looking at hormones, especially if you are a young menstruating female or you are a male under 50 years old. You don't just want to look at your testosterone, free testosterone, and what's called luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. You want to look at the raw material that supplies that chain. Again, because if we're deficient in certain raw material, you will be deficient in your capacity to produce hormones. So very often, I would say about 70% of the time when I consult to hormone therapy patients that qualify, I don't have patients, I have clients, hormone therapy clients, that qualify for hormone therapy, about 70% of the time, we don't put them on hormones. We put them on the raw material for the body to make hormones. So here's 3 things you want to test. You want to do a hormone panel, standard hormone panel. So for women, estrogen, progesterone, pregnenolone, testosterone, free testosterone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, all those things that are on a hormone panel. But you want to make certain that you are testing for DHEA, SHBG, and something, vitamin D3. If you are deficient in vitamin D3, you will have metabolism issues with DHEA. If you have metabolism issues with DHEA, you have lost the raw material that's needed to make hormones, and that will throw your hormone levels off, even though there's nothing wrong with your endocrine system. So you have to imagine that if you are building a house, it doesn't matter how good your contractor is. If you don't deliver raw materials to the job site, nobody's building anything, right? And so very often we're blaming the contractor, even though he doesn't have the raw material to do its job. So we're blaming the endocrine system, and we're holding the endocrine system responsible for a crime it's not committing. and we jump to hormone replacement therapy. And I'm a fan of hormone replacement therapy when needed, right? If you have primary hypogonadism, if you actually have a legitimate reason to be on hormones. My wife is on hormones. She's going through menopause right now. We just did a whole podcast on it, and I actually showed her Dutch test. I went through all the details of the Dutch test. I even I showed exactly what her prescription is for the different estrogens and pregnenolones. But the human body is so fascinating. It reminds me of that. What's the parable? One man's trash is another man's treasure. You take in a raw material, a cell or an organelle will actually use that raw material and it will excrete a waste product. That waste product is then used in the next phase of a cycle for an additional step. So, for example, we all have the amino acid homocysteine in our blood. The body will take homocysteine, it will break it down to an amino acid called methionine. Methionine will go up and quiet the mind. It will eventually be methylated into something called S-adenosyl methionine, which becomes S-adenosyl homocysteine, which becomes homocysteine. So it's just fascinating how you eat a piece of chicken, the chicken's useless until it's broken down into amino acids. Then those amino acids go and they build tissues and blood and natural killer cells. So going further backward on the chain and getting to the raw materials that build hormones, vitamin D3, DHEA, looking at a protein called SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, which artificially lowers your, especially testosterone and free testosterone levels, and making sure that you have the hormones and then you have the precursors, and then you look at the levels of the precursors. I promise you, if I was able to magically stick a syringe in the arm of anybody listening to this podcast and just suck out the DHEA, your hormone levels would collapse. Not because there's anything wrong with your endocrine system, but because you're missing the raw material. So those are the three areas I would do. I would start with a genetic test, then I would do a basic blood panel. The time that I would actually move to what I call the big four are if you are having unexplained symptoms that cannot be answered by classic labs. So often people are like, I just have crushing brain fog. I get a great idea in the bedroom. I walk to the kitchen. I wonder what the hell I'm doing in the kitchen. And it's happening more frequently. I can't find my keys, my wallet. I'm not able to focus and concentrate. I just don't feel like my short-term recall is what it was. So you're at a dinner party and you forget somebody's name. Or you just have this crushing fatigue, or you have weight gain for no unexplained reason. You have diffuse joint pain. You have one of those unexplained symptomology, and it's not showing up on your labs. And your doctor's telling you it's all in your head or that your labs are fine. And this happens more frequently than you can imagine. Your kidney's fine, your liver's fine, your hormones are even fine, but you just feel off. That's when I would test for the big four: mold mycotoxin, heavy metal, parasite, virus. I sincerely believe that if you address those four, you would address the root cause of the majority of autoimmune conditions and idiopathic autoimmune conditions and the majority of idiopathic conditions in the body. And these people that are having these symptoms know exactly what I'm saying, and they've probably already gone to their doctor and the doctor's like, hey, you're fine. You don't have diabetes. Your liver functions fine. Your kidney functions fine. Your hormones are balanced. I don't know why you're feeling the way that you are. So if you're one of those people, that's when I would do the next tier of testing. Basic methylation testing for everybody, basic blood testing for everybody. But if you have that kind of symptomology that seems unexplained, I can virtually assure you have one of the big four: mold mycotoxin, parasite, virus, or a heavy metal. And if you just look at the etiology of these things in the body, so the best example I can give you is if this was a mold spore or a mycotoxin or a parasite or a virus, it doesn't, and this was a healthy cell, this does not hide like this. It hides like this. And that's a really important distinction because our immune system is hypervigilant, right? So imagine it, somebody robbed the bank and then ran to your house and barricaded themselves inside your house. The police would bust down that door to get to the perpetrator. The immune system will bust down this door to get to this perpetrator. Like in Hashimoto's thyroiditis, the vast majority of the time, these people have heavy metals embedded in the thyroid. And then you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis just doesn't have one diagnosis. It can either manufacture antibodies to the enzymes, it can manufacture antibodies to the proteins, or it can manufacture antibodies to the thyroid itself. And so why would the immune system get confused and go after enzymes or proteins or cellular structures? It's not. It's not just randomly attacking your body. It's after the perpetrator that's hiding inside the walls. And so, the police weren't there to damage your door, and the immune system's not there to damage your cell. The immune system's there to hypervigilantly get the perpetrator. And I'm not saying all Hashimoto's is heavy metal, but what I am saying is the thyroid has an affinity for heavy metals. And if you are a poor methylator of heavy metals, they will very often build up in areas like the thyroid, and that's what calls the immune system. If you have Crohn's disease, you didn't just wake up one day and your immune system began to attack your colon. You had, very likely, leaky gut. And contents from inside the lumen of the gut were leaking through the single cell layer of your gut. They were entering your bloodstream, where 70% of your immune system is sitting, because that's where all the action is. And the immune system lit up and started a fight in the luminal wall of the gut. And that fight ensues, and you have antibodies to colon tissue. And now you're told you have an autoimmune Crohn's because your immune system is, for no reason at all, attacking your colon. And the first mistake we make is that we assume that the immune system has made a mistake. In my opinion, God rarely makes a mistake. And instead of saying the immune system's made a mistake, we're going to go after the immune system and punish the immune system, what if we said, I believe the immune system is acting properly. We just need to figure out why it's there. And then go on the search to find out what may have called the immune system to that location. Was it heavy metals? Was it parasite? Was it mold or mycotoxin? Was it a viral pathogen? In multiple sclerosis patients, very often they're finding helminth parasites and cystodematodes, the larvae of these parasites, burrowed into the myelin sheath, ironically at the very location where the immune system targets the myelin sheath. So the first assumption that our immune system went haywire for no reason, in my opinion, is a poor assumption. Assuming the immune system is acting properly and trying to figure out why it's kicking in the door, like who's hiding inside that the immune system is vigilantly after. And if you were to do that, you would find very often it's mold, mycotoxin, parasite, virus, and heavy metals.
I like that way of looking at it. I haven't thought about it that way.
Yeah. And I do those analogies so that people understand that, you're very likely not crazy. You know what the signs of mold poisoning are? Severe anxiety, crippling brain fog, intermittent crushing fatigue. So, those mornings that you wake up and you feel like a lead balloon and you just can't get the motor going. And then other days you sort of feel fine. If you have a young child, a prepubescent teen, or young child, and they get recurrent strep infections, I would bet my entire career that is mold toxicity, not repeated strep infections. Because, mold and bacteria have been in a fight for centuries. Think penicillin, okay, that's a mold, and strep, the bacteria. That we use mold to kill bacteria. So when you have mold mycotoxin, which also has an affinity for the adenoids, and that flares, or what we call sporulates, it lights those bacteria up, and you get a severe sore throat infection. You have all these speckles all over the place, and then you go on a huge course of antibiotics, which wipes out your gut flora, and then the adenoids sort of go back down. And then it flares up again. You're not getting repeatedly inoculated with streptococcus. You always had a mild amount of streptococcus. It just lit up like a brush fire when the mold sporulated, because these two are bitter enemies. So if you got rid of the mold or the mycotoxin, you can very often put those recurrent strep infections into permanent remission. If you made it to adulthood and never suffered from anxiety, and you're having this strange myriad of symptoms, like I'm fatigued sometimes, I've got crushing brain fog, I have a difficult time focusing and concentrating, I have no motivation because one of the side effects is not quite flat affect, but something called mood numbness, where the peaks and the valleys of mood disappear. So you don't feel passion, elation, joy, arousal. You're also not depressed. You're not clinically depressed. These are usually not the kind of symptoms, sadly, that will drive somebody to the ER or take them to the urgent care. They're things that we can live with. And we're suffering unnecessarily from a lot of these low-grade pathogens that are relatively easy to address. And this is why I think it's so important to live a detox lifestyle, if you will, starting obviously with whole foods, but making sure that you're having regular bowel movements, making sure you are hydrating every day, in my opinion, with mineral salt and hydrogen gas. And we can go down the road of hydrogen gas. I think it's the greatest. It's not even a recent discovery, but now that the science has proven the efficacy of hydrogen, I think everyone should be taking hydrogen tablets or drinking hydrogenated water. I used to be a fan of hydrogen water bottles. I'm no longer, because those seals break down over time. They're extraordinarily expensive, and the amount of parts per million that they make goes down over time. But for $1 a day, you can get 12 part per million hydrogen gas every single day in your drinking water, and use hydrogen as a selective antioxidant to restore that homeostasis. And so if you're one of those folks and you do something like a Vibrant wellness test, I have no affiliation with them, by the way. And you can use any test, but something like a Vibrant total detox test, you very likely will see that perpetrator pop up in red. And you're like, I've had severe mold toxicity. So like I said, if you've made it to adulthood and you've never suffered from anxiety, and now you're a middle-aged adult, and all of a sudden you just are suffering from anxiety out of the blue, that is almost certainly an indication that you have mold toxicity. The most severe cases of anxiety that resulted in agoraphobia, fear of leaving the house, that I participated in, all had mold toxicity.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
I don't have a watch problem or a car problem. I kind of have a biohacking problem. Most people that are watching this podcast have forgotten what it feels like to feel normal. And they're walking around at about 60% of their true state of normal. And by hydrating, mineralizing, and dropping the